So what I was going to try and do today is go through kind of three broad areas. One was to talk a little bit about the history of the unit and how it's evolved over the past now more than 4 years, pretty much 4 years, in the administration, how that's changed. Maybe I'll explain our new weird status along the way. I thought I'd show you some results. Of course, we're very much about results and impact, and of course, you've got Rory here, so some of them you may have seen, but we were going to show you at least some of the more recent ones. We have now dozens and dozens and dozens of applications across many policy areas. But I also then wanted to switch into, it's not just about trials for us. Of course, trials are really important. They can be very powerful. It's also about the routine use of it in policy. So I was going to give you some examples where we're using it inside policy, and we think it sometimes takes us to different places, interesting places. Okay, so with luck, here we go. So it all starts here. Of course, we've done some work in the previous administration, it's true, with particularly Tony Blair, but this moment, there's a certain drama to it in Britain, as there are in many other countries. This is the moment where the new Prime Minister, literally the previous Prime Minister has just driven off. It's very dramatic. They're all kind of, they walk out and say, you know, thanks for the ride and all. And staff are all there, and then they all get pushed out, and then the new Prime Minister arrives and he stands there in front of the whole pack. Why I mention this, obviously, I know the change is occurring here. To us, this is also itself a moment of opportunity, right? It's when you get this change in a system, that's when you can do dramatic and interesting new things, not just because constitutionally you can do it, but also just because that's what the system is primed for. It's ready for a moment of change. I mean, for us, we lived in a very severe, which we continue to be, a period of austerity where we were talking about, still are only halfway there, an 8% structural deficit, very substantial. I know that you're wrestling with similar things, but we've had it really bad. And of course, you had a different government coming in with different styles. So this is kind of this moment of opportunity. Because what happens is, after he's done that, he comes back in. This is actually the PM, literally, first time into the study in Downing Street. And behind him is the Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell, who's been a great supporter of this work from outset. Like, what have I actually done? And that's with Sam, his wife, of course. We were greatly helped by not only the administrative support, but also we had support on the political side. Steve Hilton, Rohan Silva, James O'Shaughnessy there. And they were there to kind of whisper in the ear of the PM early on about how, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to make a change, make a difference? So we did set this up deliberately as a skunk work. We gave it as a lot of extra freedom, and also, of course, a direct line into Downing Street. And I think that obviously gave us a great head start. We had both the administrative support inside the system from the Cabinet Secretary and so on, but also it did resonate in a political way. You know, the idea that why don't we design policy on the basis of what real human beings do and go with the grain of human nature, which seems a pretty appealing idea. And in general, try and avoid, you know, regulatory, mandatory type approaches. So these came together and they were expressed, some of you will know, in the coalition agreement. We have a coalition government, to find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. I mean, who can disagree with that, you might argue. Actually, quite a few people, it turns out. But that, in some ways, was our mandate, and we lived with it. So early on, we were very rooted in deregulatory approaches as well, like literally going back through the sort of catalogue of thousands of regulations and trying to say, well, which of these do we still need, and is there an alternative to them? But that was our starting point. So we had support from these different lines, and I think that's been important to us. And now we see a lot of this as it develops across in other countries. I'll come back to it. And you're not always blessed to have these aligned, to have both the Cabinet Secretary, in this case also former Cabinet Secretary, to be honest, you know, chair our steering board in terms of what we're doing, and also direct link to the Prime Minister. And of course, we had help from friends like Richard Thaler, who was involved from the very beginning and continues to be so, and I know we'll hear from later. Despite all that, of course, we had, you know, first of all, the reactions were, you know, it wasn't a lot of it. We had a fair amount about, you know, what were people doing? Was this illiberal, and was this going to be problematic, and was it just a sort of vanity project? I mean, the real issue, of course, is the reaction inside the system as well. So, you know, big chunks of government who think, well, if we just keep our heads down, the new kids will get bored of this thing, it'll go away, and we won't have to worry about it. But what really changed minds and attitudes in government in the UK was the results, right? So that's one of the reasons why we were always very empirical, and it's great that, you know, Rory's doing something similar here now with you, is we'll actually just figure out, does it work? Is it effective, particularly in the context when people are pushed for money? And the answer was yes. This actually, I've put this picture up, we won an award, we won a few awards, but actually also a collaborative way of working, actually second from the, well, it'll be second from the left as you're looking at it, this guy, Nick Down. And I mention him because it's these kind of sort of individuals who are incredibly important to the success for us. So Nick was, and still is, he works in the revenue service. And he was prepared to take a chance early on by actually doing some experiments. He was busy sending out tens of thousands, well, actually hundreds of thousands of letters, and he was prepared to try some variations and to try behavioral approaches. So, of course, some of you will know, it was a very successful series, saying to people, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, very effective. Even more effective to say you're one of the very few people who've yet to pay your tax on time. Led to significant increases in payment rates, and also, by the way, led to less complaints about the letters too. So it was people like them, like Nick, who really gave us a big break in the system. And it wasn't enough just to have Downing Street there. We really needed people like Nick to give us a chance. So the team was very, very small originally. Literally was it in the early days. And this particular guy has gone AWOL. If you see him, do send him back our way. But it's grown, of course, over time, and continues to grow. So by the time earlier this year, we were about 18 people. Still not huge. I mean, 18 people, but then on the other hand, with 70,000 civil servants, right, on Whitehall in the centre. In fact, more than 400,000 civil servants across the UK and 5 million public servants, let alone the rest of the population. So it gives you some perspective, actually, and about what was our approach. And a lot of it has been to work across the public sector just to get people to be more experienced and understand the character of these approaches. Right? I mean, in essence, what it is we're trying to, we have a hypothesis, if you like, which looks pretty well substantiated at this point, which is that if we design public services, including in their detail, around how actual human beings make judgments and choices, we will get public services which are easier, more cost-effective, better outcomes, and so on. It's not radical, you might think, in principle, but actually, in as far as behavioral work is telling us that often we're making mental shortcuts, that's also true for public servants. It's also true about the way we design institutions and the assumptions we've got that if we pass a law, that certain things will happen. Well, why do we think that's true? I mean, sometimes it happens, but often it certainly does not. So I just thought I'd very briefly mention how our state has changed and also why we did it. It's itself an experiment. So we would have people quite often come to us after a couple of years and we were getting steady stream of very strong results. And they would say from other bits of public service, will you give us a hand? And we'd sort of say, yeah, right. We would talk to you for half an hour and good luck with that. Because if it wasn't a PM or deputy PM priority, we just literally didn't have the time or resource to do it. So we ran a competition, actually, with the support of the PM, looking for partners, and we ended up essentially setting up, turning the BIT into a social purpose company. So it's private, it's sort of private. It is actually bound in what it does. So there are lots of approaches we get from the private sector, and we just say, no, it's not a social purpose to it. But essentially, it's now co-owned by the government, so it's still in the government family, by Nesta, which is our innovation charity, and it also has a little mutual element to it as well. So that's what we are now. I didn't particularly want to dwell on it, but I did want you to understand. The great thing about it is it means that we've now been able to work with far more bits of the public sector, particularly in the UK, but increasingly with other countries too. So it's great, and we've been able to expand accordingly. Because if you're passionate about it and you see these effects, you don't want to be saying to someone no. Public Health England, for example, came to us and said, would you help us with public health issues? Well, we're really interested in public health issues, and they have a £5 billion budget. We'd love to see them using it well. Why on earth wouldn't we want to be able to help them? So we do, and we are. And we even have help from our friends. Here's a couple of pictures from the scrapbook, if you like. There's Cass come to see us, and there's Maya, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who dropped by too. Okay, so our style and our approach, as for those who don't know it, is pretty simple in some ways. Just define the outcome. What exactly are you trying to achieve? You'd be surprised how often in policy, people aren't very specific about the actual behavior they're trying to change. And just to say, well, what exactly are you trying to achieve? And to be as specific as possible. Then, of course, we draw on the behavioral economic literature quite deeply, as I'm sure you guys do too. But we also do quite a lot of ethnography. We get out there and we see what's going on. How does it, what's actually happening on the ground? What's the opportunity? And quite often, the sort of highfalutin theory which we have sat in the office turns out not to work when we get out into the field. So in fact, there's going to collect debts, and one of Rory's early projects, for example, was putting on the stab vests and going with bailiffs, at whatever, 6 o'clock in the morning. And why would you want to do that? Because you just learn a lot in that experience. And when the door is open and you see there's a pile of unopened post, it kind of strikes you, well, why do we keep sending them letters? Why don't we send a text, which we did, turned out was much more effective. Build the intervention, of course, on the ground, and then test, learn, adapt. So in some ways, Cass alluded to it, one of the very distinctive features which we've used in the UK context is this, to be hyper-experimental. And even if behavioral insights, if it's been long since forgotten, which I doubt it, I think it's establishing itself very widely, this kind of empiricism brought to the heart of government has been a very powerful force, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that and how it's developed over the last couple of years in the UK. So the basic idea, take a population. Well, you don't have to know the answer in some ways. It's a kind of humility. You don't have to always say to your minister, well, the answer is the following. You can say, actually, we're not really sure what's the best way of doing it. But it's OK, because we're going to figure it out. We'll try a couple of treatments, have a control group, and see what was the difference between the approaches. And we'll see more of that. So I know you've seen, in this particular audience, you've seen some of our early results. That's great. So I thought I'd just show you some of more recent. I said we have dozens and dozens, so hopefully I've got a couple that you haven't seen already. And we'll give some sense of how it's also evolved over time. So I had to say something on pensions. You've heard a lot about pensions already. We changed to an opt-out from an opt-in system in the UK coming in last year, part of our work. And these are sort of some of the early results. The only reason why, by the way, this is the first block of firms, it's only 83% is because it turns out some people just aren't eligible for a pension, like they're just off, on permanent leave or whatever. Amongst those who are eligible, it's more than 90%. It's very much like David's figures. It's at 91% people who are staying in. What we also know is particularly being effective in relation to the young and low-income groups, who generally it was thought weren't going to save. So, David's talked about it. This is an issue which governments have wrestled with in many parts of the world for literally decades. And often the account is, well, Anglo-Saxons don't want to save. It's not really Anglo-Saxons don't want to save. It's just Anglo-Saxons don't want to do bureaucracy and fill in forms in the office. And if you can get that out the way, it has huge impacts. And by the way, again, politically, people were very worried about this change. But it's been really very popular. It's worked very smoothly indeed. Now, one of the things that's evolved in the last couple of years we're going to do is move from just simple, I say simple, randomized controlled trials, but also overlaying it with sort of other richer forms of data to figure out these sort of more nuanced questions, not just does it work, the intervention, but who does it work for? So we've done dozens and dozens of interventions around tax. I won't go through lots of them, but I'll just show you one particular variant. So there's this one idea which has been used in a number of countries. In fact, it was used in Israel and led to a clear negative result, which was saying to people, it's really important you pay your taxes because it pays for schools and hospitals and so on. It seems a nice thing to do. In general, it doesn't do very much. If you're collecting billions of dollars, 1% uplift is actually definitely still worth having, but it's not that effective. In the Israeli trial, they tried it with businesses, by the way, for those who don't know this, saying to business, it's really important to pay your taxes because it pays for schools and hospitals. Very clear result that businesses then paid less tax, and they lost $90 million. So tread with care. But anyway, I'm just showing you this example. So some of the effects, like telling people most people pay their tax on time, or you're one of the very few who haven't got around to paying it yet, turns out to work pretty much across all populations. But this message, you can see, doesn't work in general, but it does work in some groups. So this is a very particular group, which I'm just showing you the data from. But they're a group we turn out to be really interested in, which these are people who owe more than, in Australian dollars, $50,000. So they have got quite a big tax debt. And it turns out this message with them is really effective. And you can sort of see why in retrospect. If you owe that much money, actually that literally is a teacher or a doctor, or maybe not a doctor, a nurse. And also you can see we're looking there at an interaction, which is that when you frame it in terms of a loss, if you don't pay this, then it means we aren't able to pay for hospitals and teachers, and so you get an additional uplift. So it's a sort of kind of third generation of some of our trials, this ability to look not just in general, how well does it work, but who does it work for, and to kind of keep iterating and refining the approach. We talk a lot about personalization, and in fact, the minister talked about it earlier. And I mean, some of it's sort of obvious, but I also just want to draw your attention to, it's just about the sense of a human interaction. So here's a very simple thing. One of the things we do a lot of work on employment, because growth being a big issue for us. And we noticed that quite a lot of people who were booked in to a sort of jobs fair didn't turn up. In fact, it was only about 10% of people who you told, we booked you in because there's a whole load of jobs for this Saturday on retail or whatever, come along. And as you can see, that's our control group, and it's only about 1 in 10 actually turn up. But if you just do a really simple thing, so we just say, Rory, we booked you into this thing, blah, 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 some jobs at the weekend. Does it make a difference? Well, it does. Actually makes a pretty nice difference. If I add my name on it as well, and say, Rory, we booked you into this thing at the weekend, David, well, great. This is just done on a text, by the way, you're just receiving. If we add something else, which is just to make it, you can call it personalization. I just think it's being a human being. And we say, Rory, we booked you in, blah, 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 blah. Essentially, good luck, right? Now we've got a really good uplift, in fact. See, look, I booked you a place, good luck. What does it cost? The marginal cost of the text. I mean, we're sending the text anyway, but just writing it in this way is just so much more effective. And you can see why it is. But also, it's not just that the person turns up. Think about how they feel when they walk in that room. How do you feel when someone's actually sort of said good luck and it feels a bit more personal? You walk in with your head held high. The interesting irony is we haven't tested it, but I would put money on the fact you're more likely to, in turn, actually get the job. Okay. We work a lot with business. We've always done that. It's partly the style of government, not least because often in terms of people's behavior, it's, I often say government doesn't make pizza, it's other people do that. So we're interested in influencing other people. And here's a simple example on legacy giving. So the government has been quite interested in increasing the number of people who are giving in their wills. And in fact, there was a specific target. It's 10%, legacy 10 it was called. And you could just feel the wheels of the Treasury turning, rather like with the pensions example, of how big a tax benefit will we need in order to get 10% of people to write in their will some bequest to charity. So we thought, well, okay, while the Treasury are doing that, why don't we just go on and ask some people nicely? Because we don't write wills, but lawyers do. So we just did this trial. It was done with a large group of lawyers, sort of middle-income groups. And we just asked them, when you're doing scripts, like for a will, which they had and they were doing quite rapidly, why don't you just ask people? So there's the control group. It turns out 5% of people were writing into their will a bequest to a charity or cause. But when we just added the question into the script, hey, presto, it doubles. And if you ask a nice question like, are there any causes or charities that you're passionate about and you'd like to give to? Hey, presto. Not only that, the amount of the bequest also doubles. So it's a 6-fold increase in terms of this change, right? It's just a nice illustration of we didn't have to mandate and so on, and there's no requirement to do it. But actually, everybody's pretty happy about that. Why wouldn't you ask, right? So we do a lot of work, and we continue to do that with many business intermediaries. Here's a nice simple example. Actually, we did it a year or two back, but with Imperial, with a hospital and a guy called Dom King, who was involved in the Mindspace report. But I just think it's really neat, and we're moving back into health in quite a big way. And there's a lot of issues. Health is full of trials and experiments around what's the relative efficacy of a given drug, right? But there are loads of things in healthcare which are sort of administrative details that turn out to be really consequential too. So one of the things is clinical errors. So maybe there are no clinical errors in Australia, but in most systems it turns out there are quite a few. Actually, as an aside, there's the guys who did a lot of research on this. They were originally inspired to do it by some of the studies on cases. And one that always stuck in my mind was this guy who'd gone in for very severe ear infection. And so the clinician had written, to apply ointment, and he'd just written in a hurry. So he'd just written it in R.ear, so he'd written in. Yeah. So yeah, that's right, folks. I don't know if I have to really spell it out, but Harry here was, with his eardrops were being anally applied. You can imagine, like, what? Did I? anyhow, it's sort of comic, but it turns out there are loads of things. So here's a simple example. So in fact, you can see on this, because this is the revised form. Hey presto, doctor's handwriting is often not great, but a key thing is the prescription microgram or milligram? That's actually quite a big difference, it turns out. And it's quite hard to read the difference often. So every hospital turns out to have its own prescription charts and pay, why? And they're not normally written like this. They're instead just, simple lines. So you can just see this is really rudimentary stuff, but just by writing it in, a bit like, on a customs form and having a few lines, hey presto, it makes people write things slightly more clearly. And this is a sort of pattern of results. So this is, you can see dose entered correctly, prescriber's contact number being entered, turns out to be quite a useful thing to know. Frequency of medications entered correctly. This is from the standard, the existing trials in the sample when they were checked manually and carefully. This is with the revised chart, which we just tried in a couple of hospitals. So an aside is 750 million a year for us is our estimated losses associated with simple clinical errors. So detailed matters. Another one, as it evolved over time, we've moved away from just doing, simple one or two variant. Normally, you're confronted with many choices. So here's another health example. This is a campaign called Stoptober, and it's getting people to quit in, guess when, October. And you get referred to a website, and it looked a bit like this. Just think how many choices you've got, even on something simple like this. There's a kind of rotating carousel at the top, which is sort of turning and it catches your eyes and so on. There's having the numbers there, social proof, number of people. There's things in there about default. Should you pre-tick the box or not? And by the way, there's interesting work about defaults working differently in a digital context. Having someone's picture turns out often is quite effective. Or a personal testimonial, right? Those are all things that are sensible, but are they effective or not? And do they add up to something more effective? So we run this, I won't go through the results, but you can see, you can imagine you end up with multiple variants. Why not? Why not try them all and see what is more effective? So we do so, and then refine the website accordingly. What's the scale of the impact? Well, shifting to a more effective one gives us about, in this case, just to note it's a 1 month small campaign, but 3,000 extra people registering, most of whom we think go forward to quit. Well, that's kind of, if you think what smoking does do, if you saved 1,000 lives, one way or another, that's kind of worth doing. It's worth getting out of bed for. We'll come to another smoking one in a minute. And then some sense of continual learning. So it doesn't ever end. You keep doing these trials, these adjustments. This is a tax example recently. It was to do with people declaring capital gains that they may have made. We rewrite the letter, just writing in very simple terms, and you can see this uplift, quite a significant uplift in the terms of the average amount of tax declared and paid. We also had this sort of simple and direct, so it just tells you, click here or go to this site in order to report it. So it's going very well. Actually, our tax department got worried that they were getting too many calls, people saying, I've owed this tax. Can I pay it? It was kind of interesting. Isn't that what you wanted? Anyway, of course it mattered. And so they changed it, actually. They thought, we'll just do a simple version ourselves. Now we've got the hang of it. Thanks, guys. And there's their revised version. Actually, it turned out that they didn't get any more phone calls in the earlier one. They just got a whole load of them early on. But it illustrates this point about, well, you kind of keep testing, keep refining it. Our tax department alone, by the way, now has a behavioral kind of team of its own with 12 people in it, so it's bigger than our original team, just dedicated for tax. So in some ways, that's great. As a result for us, they've reached this point where they're much more confident, they're doing it for themselves. And then I think the last example I was going to go, which is one issue to going to scale. So I mentioned this partly as a Rory tribute. One of the trials he was involved in early on, which is actually using implementation attention, which David talked about, which is helping people to plan, like the flu jab. Think about when you're going to do it, when, where, etc. And I won't go into detail. I think some of you know the results of this, but it's basically getting people back into work. And instead of asking them, what did you do in the last 2 weeks? Did you really try hard to get a job? And people had to show they at least look for at least 3 jobs. We've been doing that for 20, 30 years. We turned it around and we said, forget the last 2 weeks, whatever. Let's ask people what you can do in the next 2 weeks and get them to plan, to be specific. When is a good time to look? What kind of job are you going to look for? And they'll write it down themselves. And, yep, there's our control group. There's our treatment group. Remember, we haven't changed people's skills or anything in some sense. We also just kind of threw everything at it in the original trial subsequently to see if we could get rid of this effect in terms of any contamination, but we're still pretty confident that we're getting a kind of 5% percentage point increase, which is huge, actually. It's absolutely enormous. So we've now rolled it across the UK. Every single job centre in the UK has now switched to this new way of doing it, to your claimant commitment. So we obviously want to move beyond a trial, but actually have that impact. And the advisors love it. They really like it, because the character of the interaction has also changed, if you think about it. Okay, we have many of those trials. I mean, the simple lesson we use this very simple mnemonic now. There was the Mindspace one, but East. If you want someone to do something, make it easy. Really make it easy, even from the most rudimentary. Make it easy to even understand. When you receive a letter from government and it's 5 pages thick and it's been written by a committee of lawyers, it turns out often citizens can't understand it. And simply writing things in plain English can be extremely effective. Make it attractive. Does it break through people's attention? Is it appealing in the sense that, hyperbolic discounting and all the rest? Social, what are other people doing? Social norms, influences, reciprocity, very powerful. And timely, rather like the point at the beginning about there are certain moments you can do things in government. That's true for most things in life, especially if your behavior has been disrupted. So if you want people to cycle to work or go to public transport or whatever, general campaigns don't work very well, but they work incredibly well if someone's just moved house. Right? In that population, it works because your behavior is disrupted, you haven't resettled into a new form. So, in order to make you just you're paying attention, now some of you, I believe, Rory just told me, have seen these results, but they're still fairly recent, and they're from organ donation. So it's something which we've wrestled with. I think you guys have also been doing so in these change of system. It's 205, anyway. There was no appetite to change to a kind of change the default and have a presumed consent in the UK. So we've been exploring a number of ways of getting more people to join the organ donor register. But what I want to do is I'm going to just show you some of the, we did it as an 8-arm trial, right? And partly the point is we don't have to know what the right answer is. When you see the answer after, oh yeah, I knew I would have said that. So by getting you to participate, also I'm trying to make a point about why we experiment. So the most basic thing is we're just introducing a new channel. If we have another way that you can join the organ donor register, that itself will bring more people across, and so it does. In this case, we're using every time you renew a tax disc in the UK, which you have to do on an annual basis. After you've done the whole transaction, and it all works reasonably smoothly, you come to the end, a so-called golden page. And it says, thank you, which we think is a nice thing to do. Thank you. And then it says, would you like to join the organ donor register? Now that in itself, a new channel we know will bring in a lot more people, actually a few 100,000 a year. But then, well, what should we say? What kind of message? So I'm going to show you the 8 versions. If you know the answer already, you have to just sit on your hands and just nod sagely. But if you don't, I do encourage you just to engage in this for a minute and ask yourself, what do you think would be the most effective message? So the control group is just, there it is, and it just says, thank you, please join the organ donor register. That seems fair enough. As it happens, you can see the other 3 here are all using social norms, right? So it says, every day, thousands of people who see this page decide to register, right? That's true. We know that's true. Because millions of people are using it. It's 20 million odd a year. But then we're using different images. One's got no image, and then one's got a group of smiley, happy people queuing up to give their kidneys. Please have mine. I have a spare. And then the other one is actually the same message, but it uses the logo of the organ donor register, which is reasonably well known in the UK, a trusted brand. So which of these do you think would be more effective? You don't have to give the answer now, but you should write it down, because we know if you don't commit, you should change your mind afterwards. Self-serving attributional biases are very powerful things. Here's the other 4, just to show you. So the first one is 3 die every day because there are not enough organ donors. So in some ways, this is using loss, actually, which we know people often respond to. But we could frame it in terms of a positive. So you could save up to 9 lives as an organ donor. Actually, I was just looking this up in Australia. You say you can save up to 10 lives as an organ, which is interesting. You've obviously got a better healthcare system. Or maybe you guys got more organs. I don't know. Then we got, you can see, if you need an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. It's kind of reciprocity, isn't it, really? You could get the logic of it. And the last one is, we know most people say in surveys, again, I did my homework, apparently 78% of Australians say that they, would aspire, like to join, give their organs. Does that sound right to you? But most people don't do it, right? So we say, if you support organ donation, which we know most people do, please turn your support into action. So there you go. There's the 8. So now you get your moment of audience participation. So who would like to, which soul who doesn't know the answer already, would like to have a go at which they think would be most effective? It's kind of mean, really, because there's good evidence for all of them, but that's all right. Someone put their hand up there? No. Come on. I thought Australians weren't coy. Yes, sir. Number 7, reciprocity. Yeah. The action one, that's the N one. Don't forget the previous ones too, of course. Yes, sorry. The one with picture of the people, thank you. One or two others? Yeah. Which one? Saving lives. Saving lives. Yeah, you're upbeat, aren't you? That's very good. One or two other. Go on. Everyone's getting of it. Same one. Very good. Should we take one from over here?
Norman, number 3 and number 7, reciprocity and Norman picture.
Okay. Very good. All right. Well, you got a sense of them, actually. Slightly ahead was the picture on those two we had there. I'll show you the results now. Here we go. It's so exciting, isn't it? Now, don't change your answers. There's our control group. Now, 2.3%. Now, you might not think that's a lot of people, but we got more than 20 million people coming through a year on the site. So that's quite a lot of people, right, to get going with. Take action. Someone said that one. And you can see it does pretty respectably well. There's a lot of people in those few percentages. Thousands of people join every day. That's very good. The little heart symbol, that works a bit. Save 9 lives, the optimists amongst it. That's, pretty similar, respectable. It turns out putting in negative phrasing is actually slightly more effective. 3, however many die a day, 3 die. Would you? So the reciprocity one. That was the first lady, actually, I think, said the reciprocity. Yeah, very good. And who went for picture? Yeah. Come on, don't be shy. Turns out it would have been a mistake. Yeah, so there is lots of evidence that adding a picture often can be effective. So particularly if you want to sell people a more expensive credit on their credit cards, adding a smiling woman is a really good way of doing it. As David said, people don't respond to the numbers. They do respond to a smiling woman, particularly if they're men, it turns out, actually. But in this case, actually adding the picture, if anything, made it slightly less effective. Now, we can argue about why that is. It could be maybe you're distracted by the picture. Maybe you're looking away, or who knows? Maybe you feel manipulated. I don't know. I don't think it's that. But the main point is we didn't actually have to know. We just ran it for a couple of months, well, only a little over a month. 1 million people take part in the 8 arms. We now know what's more effective. That little difference, that marginal difference, is 100,000 extra people a year joining the register. But the point about it is, you can say, actually, we don't have to know the answer. We can have some pretty strong hypotheses on the basis of the evidence about what we think about, how humans think about the world, and we'll try it out. And of course, we can also test as whether people find it acceptable or not at the same time. So that was some kind of quickly, we have many of these trials, as you'll have gathered, but equally I wanted to say is that we've always used it from the outset about policy too, about policy changes. In some ways, this stuff it's very powerful, it's very neat stuff, but it's also in some ways just proof of concept. Does it work, does it not? Cass alluded to this in terms of, in the US and actually in the UK context too. We use it in order to change policy too. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Now, one is reshaping markets. Now, David's comments start to bring you into this. If you are a government that is generally pro-market, that is true for the current UK government, and I assume also here, it's not enough to just generally favor markets. You have to have some detailed account of how they operate. So for us, a big issue, an early example, some of you might know, we had big issues with the energy markets. We've got 5, 6 major companies, but more than 500 tariffs. So only 1 in 10 people were switching supplier, even though they would save hundreds of dollars in a given year. So we've moved to a situation where something called My Data. It basically means your data has to be machine readable if it's out there. If they've got machine readable data about your transactions, it should be available to you too. Sorry, excuse me. And so you can kind of switch between, it just comes up, you put your smartphone against your bill, right? And it says, actually, this is your usage and your tariff. And it can just say to you, actually, this is the best tariff for you, David. And instead of it taking 2 hours and being really dull, it can take 15 seconds. Now, we already know 15 seconds may still be a little long, but it is a game changer in terms of market operation. Well, also think about that smartphone itself. Are you guys on the best tariffs as you kind of scroll down your phones at the moment? For you, the chances are not. Generally, people are not. In most countries, there are millions of alternative network, tariff, phone combinations. And when you go to get your phone renewed and they say, do you want the following thing? Actually, you don't really know. It turns out a phone company is much better at predicting what you will use than you will be, right? But in a My Data world where you've got access to your transaction data, and particularly that you can use it with an intermediary, that's a game changer in terms of market operation, right? So to use our regulatory tools in a different way. Similarly true around pensions, many such markets. To give that information back to consumers, that in fact their own information, astonishingly, is a big changer of markets. Here's another one, at risk of causing a little controversy, is electronic cigarettes. So I should say by way of background, we hadn't entirely agreed with our own health department on this. But early on in 2010, we took a view that on the basis of the behavioural literature and some other things, results coming out there, that actually we should take a deliberately light regulatory approach to e-cigarettes. Now, the UK, I should explain, probably second only to Australia in terms of the sort of vigour with which we've pursued anti-smoking approaches. We just, as you might know, we just followed you now on terms of plain paper packaging. But I'm not sure if we're in the same place as you on this one. It'd be interesting. This is, by the way, percent of smokers trying to quit through some of the main routes, and this is nicotine replacement, either over-the-counter or prescription. And we took the view that, particularly for addictive behavior, it's quite hard to get people just to stop something. It's like really hard. If you decide, you're not going to eat big puddings anymore or ice cream, right? It's kind of hard to maintain that. Better have something you can substitute to. And we thought the same very much. The evidence we felt around electronic cigarettes in terms of it's easier to substitute to an alternative. The main point, by way of background, is that it's the carcinogens in the smoke being really bad for you. Nicotine is addictive, but the nicotine per se is in some ways less of a concern than the carcinogens in the smoke. So this is actually what's happened since 2010 with e-cigarettes in the UK in terms of the percent of smokers who are then using them. So it's a bit like the earlier one. You've introduced a new channel for quitting. But it's fine, but what's it actually really done? Let me just show you. This is the percent of smokers quitting in the UK. And you can see it had been on a long sort of decline. I mean, fine, smokers were gradually quitting. But in terms of the actual quit rate, it had been falling in the run-up to about 2010. And you can see that as, you can argue about if there's other things going on, our strong interpretation is what's driven this increase to 8.5%, 9% now in our latest figures, percent of smokers quitting is e-cigarettes, right? So we've taken a behavioural view. As it happens, we've taken a view to some extent in opposition to our health department early on, certainly. And let me just turn it into numbers. Just think about what that means. 4% of smokers for us, how many people is that? It's 400, 500,000 smokers a year extra quitting, half of whom are going to be killed by the habit. It is literally millions of years of healthy life saved. And if we do the math, like Cass was talking about, the value of regulatory changes, and we say, how much would we pay for drugs to have an equivalent effect size of this sort of impact? It is 50 billion for us, 70, 80 billion dollars for you to have an equivalent impact. So anyway, at least put that into the mix. To us, a behavioural account took us to a different policy conclusion than those which otherwise we would have got to. Here's a couple of examples. So we use this in many areas. In huge swathes of economic policy, which we do a lot of work on, we often don't know what's effective or not. We were very interested in some kinds of interesting failures around why certain firms didn't ask for advice. Right, and particularly family firms, they sort of got stuck at a certain size. It looks like if they asked for advice, it would actually unlock their progress. And so we decided to roll out a big growth voucher scheme where you get this kind of, you can apply for it and you get, a few $1,000s, and you can use that money to get some advice from different sources. Fine, there was a certain behavioral component to it, partly to prompt people just to think about why they were stuck. It's a bit like the result. If you ask someone who's going to run a marathon a month before, what time do you think you'll run? That's all you do, you ask them that one question. they'll run the marathon on average 8 minutes faster, right? Which is sometimes prompting people a question makes a difference. So in some ways, that's what you're doing with the advice stuff. But the additional element we built into it is, well, let's do it as a controlled trial, right? So 1 in 4 businesses who apply for these vouchers and actually qualify, we then turn down. And we do it on a random basis. And ministers are like, oh my God, really? Can we do that? Of course, if we don't do that, we'll never know whether the program works anyway. Maybe we should spend 10 times more on it. We shouldn't spend anything at all. So we built randomization into even quite big mainstream programs now to figure out if they work or not. And by the way, so they go online and it also gets feedback. The main thing is we're driving is feedback loops in the economy, which we're quite big on. I'll leave it for now. The other thing about BIT is itself has led to quite a few further innovations inside government. And maybe I'll just mention some of those, particularly those who are building similar institutions elsewhere. So as you gather, a lot of our working has been working with other companies and other groups. We found ourselves spending so much time doing it. One of the things we noticed, if you like behaviorally, if you're a big company, you've got 26 different bits of government that keep knocking on your door saying, oh, could you do this? Could you do something a bit on the environment? Could you do this? Could you do that? That wasn't very effective itself as a mode of affecting and nudging their behavior. So we set up a dedicated team specifically to work with, in this case actually, the top sort of 75 companies in the UK, and we grew it a bit outside because it was so useful for us. Why don't we make it useful for other bits of government too? So that continues. Social action. I'm not going to talk much about it today, but we think one of the very powerful forces in behavior, because it's other people, and the capacity of designing services which enable people to help each other in relation to social care or getting them back into employment or whatever. Actually, the minister gave the example, partly, I guess, from his previous brief around aging and long-term care. I mean, a very effective program, it turns out, is something called Shared Lives in the UK, which involves just someone else, we're sort of sharing their life. So particularly for someone, say, with learning disabilities. And they kind of, sometimes, in fact, 1/3 of cases, they literally end up living with someone else who then supports them. It's very, very much cheaper. It's far, far preferred by those involved. And to give you a contrast, we have, I think, about just under 4,000 notified complaints about care in the UK. Now, 1/10 of care is now going through in these populations, this shared life stuff. Of nearly 4,000 complaints, one only came from a shared life thing where someone had the kind of individual budget and it was, people helping people. So it's been a big part. We kind of set up an innovation unit doing that work in order to deliberately try more of those kinds of approaches, grow them, and so on. Policy school, we do work actually. We had to do it anyway in order to support people to learn about behavioral approaches across the public sector. But actually, it seemed to work so well, we've now turned that itself into a kind of program in its own right. What works? I want to just talk to a minute about this, because I actually think this is a really important agenda, which I think a number of countries could and should get together behind. So I said, the boring but important part about the behavioral insight work and the team we were doing was the use of controlled trials, really very empirical methods, which Maya might talk about in the US context too. Whether you care about the behavioral approaches or not, the idea of systematically testing and building the evidence is really important. So we've gotten behind a big What Works program for everything that we do in government. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. And even kind of quirky things like well-being, happiness, we've been interested in. We've looked after that, and we've then had external reports and so on. So it's become a place where we could also sort of actively catalyze related programs too. So just a quick few remarks on those, a couple of those things. On well-being, so the PM talked a lot about this actually in 2010, and we've carried on some of the work. I personally have done a lot, and with a former cabinet secretary. This is GDP per capita, for those who haven't seen it, against life satisfaction, and it's quite good to know that more growth looks like it's a good thing, more satisfaction in our lives. There's the UK. Of course, actually, you guys have got good grounds to be very smug. You have higher life satisfaction. On the other hand, Canada is above you, and the Danes, well, look at them. They are just so happy with their lives. And they've actually been getting, their life satisfaction has been increasing steadily for the last 30 years in Denmark. Genuinely interesting. The point about it is there are other things that drive your life satisfaction other than your growth, your income, and so on. It's do you know your neighbors? And how long is your commute? And can you get to Bondi Beach or whatever it would be? And these turn out to really matter, but they tend to get systematically neglected in a lot of policy. So we try to do something about that. So we had a kind of massive measurement program now. We ask hundreds of thousands of Britons on a regular basis on other surveys, how happy are you and what's your life satisfaction and do you think the things you're doing are worthwhile? A lot of it is about just, sometimes it's feeding back into policy. This actually is just literally tracking a couple of years of data, and you can see events on it as they kind of come through. So there's the Olympics. You see, everybody got a little bit happier in the Olympics and so on. Christmas, for some reason, much better in one year than another. But you can, that's kind of amusing, but what would you do about it? I mean, one here, simple example is public holidays, right? So I think we have 7 or 8 bank holidays, public holidays. Generally speaking, it turns out, what a surprise, they're associated with higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness. Although you can literally see it in the data. So you don't ask people about, do they make you happy? You just literally go out and find out what are people happier on those days? It's not true for all of them, particularly the one in August, it turns out. So that's an interesting question. Well, when would be the best time, if you're a government, you're responsible for public holidays, if you could choose your date that would have maximum impact on population well-being? Well, why wouldn't you do that? Isn't that kind of intriguing? Here's another one, which is you can chew this data up in lots of ways, and Cass talks about the use of data. This is just a simple cut using it by occupation. And one of the ideas there was, if you were a 15, 16, 17-year-old, you're trying to decide what to do with your life, shall you come to Australia and become a lawyer or whatever it be, it's UK data, you can find out how much you'll earn. In fact, there's earnings we've got on the bottom, but what you often couldn't do is, well, what is the life satisfaction of people in different occupations? Wouldn't that be something worth knowing if you're trying to decide what to do with your life? Interesting, it turns out, it's got a lot of media coverage in the UK. Clergymen turns out to be a much better choice, it looks like, than working in a pub at the bottom there. So you might be happy in a pub, but not if you work there, it turns out. Now, it doesn't mean literally every person who would have become a publican, if they become a vicar, actually, would it literally be true in that case? No, but, well, who knows, maybe it would. But you're kind of de-shrouding it. In the words of a coalition agreement, supporting people to make better choices for themselves is a very powerful and interesting agenda. So I'd say, coming back to what works, I think it's so interesting and important, I just wanted to draw your attention. Certainly it's been a major issue for me in the last year. So we've had, certainly for more than a decade, something called NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. And so when you go to your doctor, they kind of tell you, take this drug, don't take another one, right? Well, why couldn't we do that for everything? So that's what we've been doing. Education now. So we have a big program looking at, well, what works in terms of most effective way of teaching. Early intervention. Local economic growth. If you're going to give people billions of, to a city or whatever, what is the best way of spending your money? Is it infrastructure or is it something else? Well, why don't we figure out what's the best way of reducing crime? Put it in the hands of local crime commissioners, or even now better aging. Interesting question is, well, the factors that drive crime in the UK are probably pretty similar to those in Australia or Berlin or everywhere else. We should turn it into a kind of shared international program, is our thoughts. So, in conclusion, our headlines turned from quite negative early on, or people wary, into really very positive. And they did it on the back of just very practical results. That's what kind of drove it for us. Almost every area of domestic policy, I won't go through them all, is now influenced by behavioural insights. There's really not a department we don't work with. We continue to publish our results and make them public so anyone can use them, including you guys. We remain social purpose very much in that sense. We work across the world. It's spread from the UK, Australia, of course, fantastic. But also, well, we're back with Maya. You'll have to wait for that. Hey, how you doing? As if on cue. I'm almost at the end anyway, because we need to get, yeah. Right, yeah, I'm fine. Maybe we get back to the last slide in the end. Oh, yeah?
That's one way to interrupt the conversation.
That'll do it.
I was thinking how I was going to do that, but yes, please, no, have
About 1 minute.
I didn't want to interrupt the conversation, but I was deeply conscious of the fact that Washington is, as it were, on the line, and there is Washington.
One more click, I could have had
Maya, it's very nice to see you. Time is very tight in Washington. It's Sunday night. Maya, I know, doesn't have a lot of time to share with us, but has been very patiently listening to what David has to say. You saw from earlier pictorial evidence that these two people know each other. So this is a conversation from inside the Beltway, which I know is getting more and more traction. So just to remind you that Maya is a senior advisor to the Deputy Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, and she leads the Behavioural Sciences program there. So Maya, we're very much in your hands. However much time you're able to give us, that would be wonderful. And we know that you're going to have to shoot off pretty much when you've finished. But it's wonderful to have you join us, and it's all yours.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, David, for your fantastic remarks. As you know, the UK Behavioural Insights team has been a tremendous resource and inspiration for all of us in the administration, and we continue to benefit from all of the shared lessons learned as your team continues to build capacity for this work within the UK government. I also want to thank New South Wales Government, the United States Study Centre, and Harvard for organizing this conference, with a special shout out to Rory Gallagher for all of his hard work in making this conference possible, and for the invitation to talk about my work at the White House. So I serve as Senior Advisor to the Deputy Director for the Social and Behavioral Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'm actually an academic by training, so I got my doctorate at Oxford in cognitive psychology, and I just recently finished a postdoc last year at Stanford in cognitive neuroscience, and that's when I was steeped in the judgment and decision-making literature and saw the profound impact that insights from these fields could have in the policy space. It's also when I read Nudge for the first time. So when I joined the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the spring of 2013, I came with the goal to translate research insights from these fields into improvements in federal programs and policies. But I soon came to see the immense value of actually trying to institutionalize the continued translation of this research into policy improvements and policy design, given a broader administration effort to promote evidence-based policy, and of course the inspiration from our friends across the pond in the UK. So I pitched the idea of creating a team of behavioral science and evaluation experts who could provide to agencies conceptual and technical support that would allow them to design and implement rapid, iterative trials that use behavioral insights and, of course, build upon the evidence base that we're using in this policy sphere. So as Dick always says, make it as easy as possible for people to be able to use these sorts of approaches. Of course, the creation of this team did not happen overnight. I began my mission as a one-woman band, going from agency to agency, telling them about the potential benefits of behavioral science, asking them what problems they were already trying to solve, and then empowering them with the low-cost tools that could help them achieve these goals more effectively and efficiently. I also shared with them success stories from other federal agencies who had already started to embrace these approaches, and also stories from around the world, especially examples from the UK BIT, given the policy space and the fact that they could see this work going on in another government context. And so over time, a community of practice has been forming, and thanks to a fantastic collaboration with the Performance Improvement Council at the General Services Administration, we successfully launched the U.S. Social and Behavioral Sciences team in January of 2014. I have 6 teammates, and we have been hard at work for the last 5 months. As you all know, this work is extremely challenging. I think there's no shortage of excellent ideas in the field or willing collaborators, but what I found is that identifying testing platforms within a federal government context that allow for rigorous experimentation. So, in other words, ones that have a sufficient sample size, power, the ability to randomize, access to administrative data and all the relevant outcomes, existing program funds to help fund these low-cost pilots, et cetera, is definitely no small feat. But we are really excited about the potential of this work to potentially have the same kind of impact that we saw in the UK and now in governments all over the world. Our hope is that in addition to demonstrating the impact of behavioral science in policy, we'll also be able to improve the quality of evaluation that goes on in the federal government and to develop ongoing knowledge and an ongoing knowledge base of what works and what doesn't. And I really look forward to sharing the results of our first year of research with you at this time next year. I guess I'll conclude by saying that I'm incredibly excited about the goals of this conference and the fact that we're bringing together thought leaders from around the world. I had the honor of speaking at the United Nations a couple weeks ago, and I was struck by how the global community is truly embracing the power of behavioral science. So I think the word is definitely spreading, and I'm really, I feel honored and privileged to be part of this international movement. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful morning.
We're interested in the Share Lives program from the point of view of, we've been thinking for a while about social welfare interventions. You're sort of thinking about the fact that the reason why the placebo effect is the mere act of paying attention to people improves their well-being. And so not to diminish that as a powerful impact, but how much do you think merely being paid attention to improves well-being?
Yeah, well, we're very human, we're very social beings, right? I think it's very consequential. So I think the short answer is surely yes. There's a whole host of those kind of programs. I was already going to overrun anyway, but or maybe we can talk separately about them, which essentially have that character of people helping people. I mean, a wonderful thing about how we're designed is when we reciprocate and help someone else, we generally know, like in mentoring programs or volunteering, it increases, not only does it increase the other person's well-being, in fact, the effect is larger on the person who's the volunteer or the mentor, right, generally. In fact, typically almost double the effect size you'd see. But a little detail in our evolution is that, we've heard of oxytocin and how it flows, and it's the feel-good, It actually happens when someone reciprocates and that's acknowledged. Thank you so much for that, which is sort of beautiful in terms of game theory terms. We're hardwired to feel good when we help other people and they recognize that in their eye, So I think it's a surprise, but the weird thing is that most public services haven't been designed in that way, and I think that we've been nowhere near as good as we can be to utilize people's capacity and desire to support and help each other in small ways. They don't have to be in big ways. And Shared Lives is just one, it's quite a big ask in some ways, people are paid for it, but of a much wider set of programs that have those characteristics.
Great. I've got a question for Maria, and then I've got a hand up here, and then probably one at the back, and that might be it. Right here. And then that one's next. Thank you. Thanks, Maria.
Maria Katsonis from the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, David. Right. Our table had a really interesting discussion about the application of behavioural insights. Now, our question doesn't want to diminish the pioneering work of you and your unit, but we seem to think that things such as savings, signing of, where you put your signature on your tax form, issues such as, fines reform, meeting appointments, tends to be the low-hanging fruit. It's the transactional side, if you like, of public policy. We want to know, I guess, where is the next level going to go in terms of behavioural insights when we start to think about intractable social problems, obesity, domestic violence, child protection. It seems to us that most units that are following in your footsteps, so to seem, are, first mover. They've got the first mover advantage, are replicating what you have done already. What's the next level in terms going to take us?
Right, very good. Thank you for that question. And I tried to allude a little bit to it, which is that there's a kind of, in fact, my last slide, which it's fine, we didn't need to get to it, it's too long anyway, which was a kind of answer to that question, which is the sort of bottom of the pyramid. It's the very nuts and bolts transactional stuff. It's sort of a no-brainer. Although, to me, it's almost proof of concept, because you can introduce it into a system, you can very easily work out what's the value, and the marginal cost is nothing. And then it was like, oh, actually, well, that's all right, well, that's sort of sensible. But in many ways, it goes to these next levels. So it can get to more complex issues, number one. Actually, the employment work starts to be that. Changing the character of transaction in a deeper way. It's slightly humanity to it, which is a part of that story. We think that's also true in other areas, like in relation to some of the ones you mentioned. Troubled families is a big area where you've got some of those same characteristics. Or it's also, though, about, like I tried to give a couple of examples about, it makes us think about policy in a different way. It makes us think about markets in very different ways. And what's the role of regulators? And how do you reshape markets so that people can make the decisions they care about? Even on something like pensions. And David has shown you, if you had any doubt in your mind, we're pretty rubbish at and not very interested in a lot of those sort of calculations side of a pension. But there are some human sides to it which are really important. The person has to decide, well, do you want to support your partner? Do you want to be able to pass on assets to your kids? Like, what matters to you? That's the bit which we should design services and transactions to do that's the human bit, which we can't do the calculation of. And the other stuff, the boring bit, we should be able to engineer out. So, to me, my frustration is, on the one hand, we had loads and loads of successes, and it's wonderful to sort of not be alone now and see lots of other countries more and more moving into the space. But you also get a sense of half empty. So you've mentioned obesity, lots of big public health issues. You just think there are so many behavioural examples, and just on public health alone. Our current estimates, right, are typically 75% of years of healthy life lost into known behavioural factors. Is that where we spend our money or our effort? Of course it's not. Even on research, in the UK, our estimate is less than 0.5% of medical research is on behavioural factors. It's nuts, right? So yes, there are many frontiers.
Okay. Cool. We'll take that question, and then the one at the back of the room, and then that'll have to be quick. So let's keep it fairly brief if we can. Thanks.
Hi there. I'm Mike Daniels from the Behavioural Architects. We were intrigued on our table because you mentioned that defaults work differently in the digital space, and you didn't explain it. So we wondered if you wouldn't mind elaborating, please.
Yeah, very briefly. The person who's doing very interesting work on this moment is Shaloma Benazzi. But it looks like this. Let me just say that. Some of the issues about clicking a box or signing a box, we're learning, maybe as citizens we're learning, that there's so much less friction that some of the effects look different in that space. So one of the reasons why we're very into testing and trialing is that history has told us, rather like Cass's example of we can't see the water, we often, it teaches you humility. If you're changing the context or in a slightly different way, you might have changed much more than you think you have. And one of those things is happening when you move to the digital world.
Okay, let's take the last question. If I could just ask you to stand up. Sorry, I should have asked you to do that for everyone. I apologise for that. And just introduce yourself, and then we'll ask the final question, and then we'll have a wrap.
Hi, I'm very loud. I'm Robert Bosey from New South Wales Development, Family and Community Services. Just a question about celebrity endorsement and the role of that in nudge actions.
Yeah. In the original Mindspace report we did early work on, that the M was messenger effects. It matters who says something. And there are clearly some examples. They aren't necessarily celebrity, though. People too readily. I actually noticed it, particularly in public servants, we often see that, oh yeah, let's get a celebrity. It's like, why do you think that will work better? For example, than an expert. So in healthcare, we have learned through bitter experience that getting a minister to get out and tell everybody they should get their kids vaccinated turns out not to be very effective. Getting your chief medical officer with a stethoscope around them saying you should get your kids vaccinated works really well. My point is, it's not celebrity per se, it can be other aspects. As a smaller side, we did run one particular trial on giving where one of the arms was the introduction of a celebrity. We were asking investment bankers to give a day of their salary, which is quite a lot, actually, to charity. And we had a number of arms in it, and one was, a letter that comes from the CEO or an email or whatever, and it was like 5% of people were giving. Adding a celebrity got it to 7%. I find they weren't necessarily the biggest, it wasn't Angelina Jolie or anything, but they were sort of people, sports people and so on. But to put it in context, if people were offered a little tiny tub of sweets when they got their thing and they came in with a leaflet with the sweets in it, and they got an email from a named individual instead of the CEO, you got 17% of people would give, as opposed to 7% with a celebrity. So it can be effective, but I think they're going to get blown away with it. Lots of other things going on too. And often, much more important is your neighbour. Right? Or someone you talk to, or a friend. It can be something very different. And the social milieu is much more powerful often than a celebrity.
Fabulous. That's a great note on which to end. Thank you, David Halpern. Please join me in thanking David and Maya Shankar as well. Thank you. That's fantastic.